My goodness, the only way that we advance in healthcare or in any field is through research, by the hit and miss of research. And if we stop paying for that research, we're holding back the future well-being of this planet and the inhabitants of this planet. And I'm not just talking about humans, but any species, whether they're animal species or plant species. We were given brains. Brains are meant to use to think, to question. And if you don't encourage that, then we're going to move backwards. Okay? We don't want to be Neanderthals. We want to be smart. We want to use knowledge to advance it.
Welcome to the Tech Cast. We'll bring you all things science, engineering, technology, and innovation. Today we are joined by Dr. Bruce Gillis, a Harvard-trained physician and medical researcher with over 4 decades of clinical and scientific experience, including operating his own medical practice. He holds an MD from the University of Illinois and an MPH in epidemiology and occupational medicine from the Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Gillis has served as a professor at both UCLA and the University of Illinois College of Medicine, and has held leadership roles at groundbreaking institutions, including Epigenetics and most recently the Center of Immunology Science. His work has been at the forefront of identifying the biological underpinnings of fibromyalgia, challenging long misconceptions, and leading efforts to develop diagnostic and treatment protocols that focus on immune system deficiencies. He has collaborated with major research centers, including Stanford, Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Virginia. As a physician, clinician, and scientist, Dr. Gillis has dedicated his career to bringing clarity and compassion to complex and often misunderstood conditions. So, Dr. Gillis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you and your audience.
Okay, so we'll dive in. So, firstly, can you tell us about the about epigenetics and its mission to bring clarity to patients?
Well, epigenetics no longer is an entity anymore. It initially served as a vehicle to do research in conjunction with the University of Illinois College of Medicine, and it was involved in trying to determine if fibromyalgia was a real disease. It is no longer around because the science has evolved. There has been great breakthroughs since epigenetics began, and now we are working through the Center for Immunology Science. That is the only ongoing entity at this moment. What we have learned is the body's immune system plays a very critical role in a number of illnesses, major illnesses that affect tens of millions of people, not just in the United States, but probably hundreds of millions of people around the world. For example, we did research in conjunction with colleagues at the University of Illinois College of Medicine, and we identified the fact that the reason people appear to suffer with long COVID is because their immune system becomes modified by the virus. And so we have been working with introducing a diagnostic blood test. We have also been involved in developing compounds that can boost the body's immune system and, as a consequence, lessen and potentially eliminate symptoms associated with a number of chronic illnesses, be they fibromyalgia or long COVID or chronic fatigue or the urologic problems of interstitial cystitis / painful bladder syndrome, which reflects a research study that we did in conjunction with the Department of Urology at the Stanford Medical Center, an article of which has been drafted, and we hope to submit for publication very soon.
Interesting. So, what was the biggest missing piece in understanding fibromyalgia that your research uncovered?
So, when we talk about fibromyalgia, uh, when I first entered the field more than 15 years ago, it was considered a bogus affliction of neurotic, hypochondriacal, hysterical women, that there was no real disease. It was labeled a syndrome, and a syndrome, by definition, is nothing more than a collection of subjective symptoms. We strove to determine if there really was a underlying disease process. And we ultimately discovered, in regard to a very large clinical study that was done with my staff and the Department of Pathology at the University of Illinois College of Medicine in Chicago, we were able to identify the fact that these people have specific immune system deficiencies. They come about because one of the types of white blood cells in the immune system are defective. And due to that defectiveness, they are incapable of manufacturing normal quantities of 4 specific proteins. We did a study, took several years, to make sure that identifying these deficiencies were indeed specific for fibromyalgia. And we were able to prove that that is true. What's happened since then has been even more important. We have been able to identify that 100% of people with a positive fibromyalgia blood test have unique DNA genomic signatures. In other words, we have DNA proof that fibromyalgia is a specific and unique medical disease, and that if you test positive for the disease based upon the diagnostic blood testing that we uh, are offering via a independent laboratory, you can be assured that you have particular DNA, and that's why you have the disease. Now, why did this all happen? Well, we're working on the presumption that a human coronavirus may have triggered a DNA process which is called epigenetics, where, in other words, your DNA evolves over time. So, as a child, your DNA acts in one way, but as you're exposed to the environment and environmental pathogens or chemicals, etc., it will become modified. And we are assuming, because of our research in long COVID, where we saw that the COVID-19 virus, which is one type of human coronavirus, has caused the vast majority of people with long COVID to experience an epigenetic change such that they now have immune system deficiencies that didn't previously exist. So that's what we have been discovering, and that is what we are pursuing. We are also seeing something similar in regard to the urologic problem of interstitial cystitis, which is also called the painful bladder syndrome. And we are developing related diagnostic tests for that as well. An easy analogy to understand this epigenetic process is what happens as a person ages and gets skin cancer. As a youth or as an adolescent, they sit out in the sun, they get sunburns, and that's because of the damage produced, the acute damage produced by the ultraviolet rays of the sun. And then decades later, those areas then develop cancerous changes, and that's because of the epigenetic change of the DNA in those skin cells. So we're evolving and understanding this very well. What we're also able to report is a major appreciation of how we can modify the body's immune system, and as a result, lessen the symptoms associated with these maladies. In research that was begun in the 1990s in Europe, cancer researchers looked at pathways to try and get cancer patients to be more receptive to the potential benefits of anti-cancer chemotherapeutic drugs. And what happened is they found a family of non-pathogenic bacteria. And based upon that, I also looked at that family and was able to identify that certain strains of that bacteria could reverse the immune deficiencies that we see in patients. And as a result, we've now developed compounds that have had great efficacy for people with fibromyalgia. And we're about to start a clinical trial in regard to patients with long COVID as well.
Okay, it's interesting. So, tell us, Dr. Gillis, um, how does your work on fibromyalgia help understand long COVID, since both are complex and often misunderstood?
Well, as it turns out, a number of physicians described that patients with long COVID had symptoms that were identical to fibromyalgia. And based upon that, we decided to say, well, if these people really have these symptoms consistent with fibromyalgia, we ought to test those long COVID patients for the same diagnostic parameters that exist in fibromyalgia. And in the first study we did, we found that 86%, nearly 9 out of 10 people with long COVID, tested positive for fibromyalgia. And we're hopeful that we can recruit more long COVID patients and work on a larger population to further substantiate these initial findings. The first study was indeed published, and now we're trying to recruit volunteers with long COVID to also test them for fibromyalgia / immune system deficiencies.
So, what role did your public health background from Harvard play in building a diagnostic tool?
What I learned when I was at Harvard was a more in-depth appreciation for disease processes. The area of epidemiology is the study of epidemics, why people get ill. And that dates back hundreds of years to a researcher who realized that people who drank from a particular well in London were prone to getting cholera. So he was able to show that the water was contaminated in that well. And that was the study of this basic epidemic. We have since used epidemiology to study all sorts of diseases. For example, epidemiology looked at why did people develop lung cancer and ultimately found a very strong association to the chemicals produced by cigarette smoking. So epidemiology is the study of diseases, disease trends, and the factors that relate to them. And in medical school, you really don't get much specific education about these disease processes. The emphasis is just on diseases themselves, how to diagnose them, how to recognize what may cause them, and how to treat them. But understanding the in-depth pathways is not usually part of most medical school curricula. Other things that I learned about in the School of Public Health was the analysis of statistics to determine the accuracy or inaccuracy of research findings. I additionally learned more about the intricacies of the delivery of healthcare, how to address trends based upon different groups of patients, whether it's based on gender or ethnicity or living conditions or where they live in the world. So it gives you a much broader aspect of it. One of the great relationships of public health here in the United States has been the U.S. Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control that look at various aspects of public health to better understand diseases and how to address them, such as why do you promote vaccinations? What can that do in longevity? Why do people get certain particular diseases because of environmental influences where they live? For example, we know here I'm in Southern California, that people who live near high density roadways, we call them freeways here in Southern California, have a higher incidence of certain cancers. Obviously, it seems to be related to the exhaust produced by trucks and other vehicles that they're living near. So those are important aspects of public health that I learned during that time frame. And I also did a related residency, medical residency in epidemiology through the School of Public Health at Harvard. And initially studied a particular interesting diseases of butchers who were getting lung disease because they were using a particular type of material, a type of cellophane to wrap uh, beef after it was cut. And to make that cellophane stick together, they had to burn it. And when they burned it, fumes from the cellophane were inhaled by the butchers, and they got a disease which ultimately was called meat wrappers asthma. Once we learned that, we learned how to change how to wrap meat so that you wouldn't be exposed to toxic fumes any longer.
Interesting. So, Dr. Gillis, you've had such a diverse career as a physician, professor, researcher, and entrepreneur. So, what's one skill or mindset that was always essential across all these different roles?
Um, I grew up in a very rural environment. It was economically stressed. We didn't have great means because of this rural area. And I saw lots of people getting sick who you didn't think ought to get sick. Okay. And it piqued my interest as to why people develop certain particular diseases. Diseases aren't necessarily just genetic, they're environmental. And so I decided to pursue those avenues. As a matter of fact, when I started medical school, my first year of medical school, I worked with a well known professor at that time who was involved in environmental medicine and environmental health. And I found it eye opening as to why certain people are more vulnerable to certain or particular diseases. And I've always pursued that aspect when I evaluate patients or patient groups. And yes, I've had a very varied level of interest. For example, I worked to establish with others an environmental consulting company. That was the consulting company that ultimately oversaw, you may recall, the major Alaskan oil spill that we had decades ago. So I looked at that. I worked with an airplane manufacturer who needed to coat the inside of the fuel cells of airplanes, and why the people who worked in those environments were getting particular illnesses, often liver-related illnesses. I worked on the space shuttle because the space shuttle had silicon tiles on the surfaces because when it would come back through the Earth's atmosphere, it would get very hot, and the silicon tiles would reduce the heat load on the airplane. And there was a concern as to whether or not the exposure to the silicon particles caused the installers of those tiles to get ill. So yes, I pursued a variety of disease processes, trying to determine the quote unquote mystery of them.
That is great. So, what has been the hardest part about moving your discoveries from the lab to actually helping patients in doctors' offices?
The hardest part has been the economics of medicine. Medicine is a business, at least it is here in the United States. Um, certain Drug companies want to sell you drugs because they're going to make a lot of money, not necessarily because they're going to cure anybody. Um, they're going to promote their drugs, even though the science that has been used to get their approval is questionable. And even though subsequently accomplished scientific discoveries have proved there are more effective and better ways to address disease processes, but the enormity of businesses in healthcare is often discouraging. And as a result, it often deprives patients of the latest breakthroughs, the latest interventions, and ways to increase their longevity and the quality of their life. So I would have to tell you that as a physician, um, while my message may be accurate because everything I've done has been peer reviewed and published, uh, and when someone cannot find fault in that research, they, because of economic reasons, will attack me as a person. In other words, we can't kill the message, so we're going to try and kill the messenger.
Okay, so for scientists listening, what's one lesson you've learned from turning research into real products that help people?
Well, everyone has their opinions about certain medical conditions, and that's to be invited. That's the part of science that's interesting because you hear other people's opinions. But unfortunately, you need to filter out those opinions that stop relying on science, that start relying on innuendos, that rely on disinformation. Here in the United States, you may be aware of the fact that we are being pummeled by disinformation. For example, you shouldn't take vaccines that have been proven to be beneficial and with minimal risk for not years, but decades, or that vaccines could give you autism when that was proven over and over again to be a falsehood, which was promoted by a doctor in England who was paid by a law firm to promote that claim so that law firm could sue vaccine manufacturers and collect big fees. Um, so there's an awful lot of disinformation out there, and it is frightening. And here in the United States, we are seeing a devastating effect, not just on disinformation, but by the decision to reduce and then oftentimes eliminate funding for medical research. My goodness, the only way that we advance in healthcare or in any field is through research, by the hit and miss of research. And if we stop paying for that research, we're holding back the future well-being of this planet and the inhabitants of this planet. And I'm not just talking about humans, but any species, whether they're animal species or plant species. We were given brains. Brains are meant to use to think, to question. And if you don't encourage that, then we're going to move backwards. Okay? We don't want to be Neanderthals. We want to be smart. We want to use knowledge to advance it, because thoughts that we at one time thought were accurate or believed to be accurate decades ago, we've proven through continuing research to maybe not be so accurate, right? Um, I'll give you a wonderful example. When AIDS came on the scene, people had all sorts of crazy ideas. You could get it from a mosquito bite or from a fly, okay? Or by sitting next to somebody who had HIV. We know that that's not true, okay? That was all disinformation. And how did we prove that? By doing medical research. So my goodness, why would you not encourage continuing medical research? From my perspective, I think that it's ludicrous not to promote medical research. We may not always get the answer right away, And maybe the first answer isn't always correct, but the fact that we continue to do this research, to continue to explore the boundaries of nature, is the most vital part of being alive.
Wow, that is wonderful. So tell us, do you see technology and artificial intelligence helping diagnose complex illnesses like this in the
I,
future, like fibromyalgia, of
well,
course?
I can tell you that artificial intelligence cuts two ways. Okay, artificial intelligence, from my perspective, as whenever I've tried to apply it, has done nothing more than regurgitate prior information, and oftentimes brings up information that is incorrect or is erroneous. All right. So that to me is very worrisome, extremely worrisome. For example, if you do artificial intelligence analysis of fibromyalgia, you come up with all the cockamamie crazy ideas of decades ago. That it's a female disease, that these women are neurotic or they're hypochondriacal, you know, and that to me is the negative side of artificial intelligence. But what artificial intelligence might be able to do is to identify pathways that we may not have fully explored. And it brings it to the forefront to say, well, look, here's an idea that may have some benefit. But as far as I'm concerned, artificial intelligence right now is in its infancy. And I'm also unhappy with the application of artificial intelligence to replace human beings. All you need to do is try and make a phone call to contact your credit card company or somebody else on the internet, and you're talking to a machine who doesn't understand what you're trying to explain to them because it's too abstract. Artificial intelligence at this moment is far too rigid in my perspective. And I don't like machines replacing people. Okay. Machines can be very helpful as an adjunct, but they're not primary. The person is primary. That's how I believe it. And remember, if it wasn't for the person, there couldn't have been artificial intelligence, right?
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that is such a good perspective. So finally, Dr. Gillis, I'd like to normally ask this one as the last question for the guests I interview here. So tell us, what does innovation mean to you, and how does it relate to your field in medical diagnostics?
Well, innovation means continuing to pursue explanations for why health problems develop and how best to treat them, but always understanding that you're not just looking at one particular point in time when it comes to approaching healthcare and healthcare therapies. You need to monitor what you're doing to see if it is efficacious and also determine if there are other pathways that could be beneficial or potentially injurious. So it means that when you go to sleep at night, your brain doesn't stop. All right. In other words, you're still active. You're still trying to understand certain issues and to question the accuracy of past ideas. It's because I was willing to question the past ideas of fibromyalgia that we learned that why the disease happens, and we discovered how DNA is a critical explanation for the disease. Yet, in today's world, despite that information, I can say that maybe up to 50% of people still refuse to believe it, okay? Still are what we call fibroskeptics and still promote absolutely inane ideas. All you need to do is get onto social media and type in fibromyalgia. And the remarks you hear from patients and practitioners literally makes the hair on your back stand up because it's so wrong and it's so unscientific. And it's the same thing now with vaccines. We thought we had eliminated the disease of measles, and all of a sudden now, because there are people out there who don't want to take the vaccines, we're seeing an epidemic of measles, and measles is a disease where people can, especially children, can die. And it's inexcusable. So for me, being a physician means always being open to looking at perspectives to promote better well-being, better health, better therapies, and knowing that you can always explore mysteries and potentially unravel them.
That is wonderful. So, lastly, Dr. Gillis, tell us where can our listeners contact you or learn more about your work?
Well, there is a website for the fibromyalgia blood test called the THE Fibro Test. It's thefibrotest.com. The compound, there's another website that concerns the testing for long COVID called the number one, test.com. The compound that we developed to help people with fibromyalgia and related diseases, that is a compound called Imbix, IMBXX, which stands for Immune Boost. So you can go to imbxx.com, and you can always contact me and send me emails. I've got a real easy email address. It's bruce@gillismd.com. Pretty straightforward, right? bruce@gillismd.com.
Yeah.
And I don't charge patients for the phone calls and to discuss these issues. I'm open to talking to their doctors. I don't charge for that either. I feel it's my obligation to do that because I want people to be as healthy as is humanly possible.
Wow, that is wonderful. Dr. Gillis, it's been a really exciting conversation with you, and really happy to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk to you and talk to your audience. And hopefully, I've helped at least one person out there get better because of what they've heard today. Thank you.